Well, now I propose to listen to all your questions. Some people came in to propose some questions. I said, put them in public. So feel free now to bring up conceptual issues, whatever you feel is worthwhile to share with your colleagues. And also, as you are from so many countries here, I think it's very interesting to hear your reactions. If you didn't understand some aspects that I presented, I'll do it also. So we have plenty of time, more than we had supposed. We can work until 1 o'clock, no? I think it is, no? Okay, because then obviously everybody is hungry. But feel free to make the questions. Try to make them short so we can have a larger number of persons talking. Okay? Well, I don't know your names, so each of you who make your questions, and somebody has a microphone of the supporting group. Where is the microphone? This one, I think you have to use then. I have this one here. I have several, but I can use. Mariana se va a pegar micrófono. Él se pegó. I prefer to have this so I can move around and look at each of us, although I need my glasses. Oh, okay. I'm trying to see. I will not forget anybody, but my memory is short when coming to look. Somebody raised hands there. Okay.
Hi. Good morning. My name is Adrian. I'm from Mexico. I think when we talk about interdisciplinarity, it's like a really polemic subject. In my experience, it's been kind of hard. So what can you advise us to try to change the system, like how we used to work, and how can we do that now? How can we convince the rest of the scientific community? Because it's not only like the old people, it's also sometimes with our peers that are even from our same age. For me, it's been hard because I'm like the only one who's trying to do like this new thing with interdisciplinarity. So what could be your advice?
Mm-hmm. You are from which area? Oceanography?
Fisheries.
Fishery, okay. There is no recipe. There are convictions. There is a way of understanding the importance that interdisciplinarity can really help or support a better understanding of a process and its complexity. So there are some essential ideas or concepts that have to be stressed. I think one has to be, as I mentioned, convinced, stubborn, innovative, and provocative. And basically, in our program of environmental sciences, most of our students come from disciplinary areas, and what they come to the program, they make their project, etc., because they want to have a different approach to what they're doing. So the answer is not easy because it can be very, say, voluntaristic. What I believe is that the complexity of the issues today demand that we are more able to dialogue with the difference. Say, we're doing now a project I mentioned on the macro metropolis of São Paulo and environmental governance, and I never worked with models, but within this project I invited meteorologists to work with models. And then he said, whoa, but I'm going to work with you sociologists. I don't understand anything. Okay, but we don't understand either of models. So it's the beginning of a necessary dialogue to make a stronger understanding about the role of actors, no? Of the different actors within a process. Say, it's very interesting because some years ago, and say the IPCC is a good example, because some years ago IPCC was absolutely focused on a more, I don't like to use the word hard science because I don't like to use it, but I want to say the science, the word, now I forgot, sorry, I want to use it, the physical sciences, different chemistry, biology, climatology, geology, all the so-called sciences that deal more with metrics than the social sciences that also can deal very much with metrics, doing quantitative surveys, for example. But there was a very, say, lack of, say the word, desconfianza, lack of trust between the different areas of knowledge. And today, what the meteorologists, the climatologists see is that their data are not understandable without a basic decodification. So what we need more and more is to be establishing exactly this dialogue. Say, today the climatologists need social sciences to bring up a proximity with society, because still people deal on a very subjective understanding of processes. We can have a more rational understanding, but basically population deals with much more subjective issues. So interdisciplinarity brings us also to deal with subjective and intersubjective understanding, and with something that I have been dealing more in my different researches, that is social learning, the dynamics where you create spaces of dialogue. And there we can share a little bit more. I don't know if I answered your question, but definitely the issue is when your colleagues do not believe, I'm sorry for them, but what else can I say about it? Because it's not that it is a something that everybody has to believe, but definitely it is much more how you understand your role in terms of producing knowledge. Who else? Well, let's see. Here. Sorry if I forget somebody. I don't know if somebody wants to write the names of those who want to participate. It's easier. Please. Here. That's good. Okay, there she is. Okay.
Hi, here.
I talk without glasses, so I don't see very much.
Hi, I'm Aline, and I worked with governance, and I've seen a lack of knowledge of some stakeholders into some discussions, meetings, and councils. So I wonder about the representativeness of these stakeholders. And I wanted to know, what do you think about this sometimes lacking of representativeness of some person who are in the stage talking about some sector? And how do you see this issue and how this results into a democratic or pseudo not so democratic governance?
Look, I think that the issue that you bring up is very relevant. There is, and always we have to look at the issue of representativity. And this has to do also, basically when we talk about social movements, no? Not necessarily of NGOs, because the dynamic is different, but in many cases, social movements also have the same kind of bias than politics in terms of the permanence of people and the not sharing of power within an organization. So this can be really very negative in terms of representation. But the main, well, obviously when it's not representative, it somehow indicates a kind of authoritarian attitude in terms of being part of a process of representation of a certain social group. In many cases, it's also because of the lack of emergence of other actors within the process. But definitely, in some cases, it's also because there is a kind of perverse situation where a representative of a social movement can be a person who is directly linked to a municipal councillor, representative, etc., and it's just making part of a lobby and not necessarily representing the real interests of a social group. I think that is unfortunate, but this has to do with the logic of organization of each social movement. Unfortunately, this can happen, and that's the worst for the social movement that considers important to be represented and also to be defending ideas or proposing or questioning. So it's all part of how mankind is organized and how these logics are not only into the so-called politics, but also into what Ulrich Beck calls the sub-politics, or us. No? I don't know if I answered your question. Okay. Now.
Hi, I'm Luis from Brazil, and I developed my research in a protected area, in a historian protected area, which has 3 different traditional indigenous populations. And they have chair in the councils, but mostly they doesn't go some meeting because they argue that what they say doesn't be accounted. And most of the stuff that they say has happened, as the drought, the loss of some shellfish, changing fish composition and densities. And to solve this kind of problem, they go to us in the university, but most of them has masters and PhD, and they aren't listened by sub-government, and sometimes they go to people that has less studied than them, but are more listener. So how can we promote the truth between these traditional indigenous that in the Brazilian history are marginalized with the government?
Good question. There are no rules for it. I think that the main aspect is the lack of democracy, or those who reject the space that indigenous population has. You have examples where the articulation between an NGO and indigenous population has had an excellent outcome in Brazil, like the case of Greenpeace and the Mundurucus in the dam in Tocantins, for example. So it depends also on the alliances, depends in the capacity of dialogue. There is no recipe, but basically sometimes some ethnic groups are very, what's the word, principist, no? They have their principles and they don't move from their principles. I'm not making any kind of comment in terms of the specifics because I don't know it. But I think that there is a role of the mediators because what we see, unfortunately, is that indigenous population has practically no representation in Congress. There was a time where 1 or 2 representatives were there. So it has to do with Brazilian history, with Brazilian logic of representation of the so-called minorities. They are minorities because they were killed, but not minorities because they are the original people of this country. No? So I believe that there is a relevant action to be taken by mediators. I don't know how much NGOs are involved, but definitely there is an authoritarian bias when you don't take into account the issues that are presented by indigenous population. No, I think this is an aspect I don't know in other countries how this takes place. Definitely there are societies where indigenous population have a strong role still. Even here in Latin America, in example, in Bolivia, no? So I don't know if I give you a good answer because I don't have recipes. I don't have a recipe for anything, not even for a thesis, but say there are processes that you have to consider in terms of how you establish dialogues, how you establish the codes of dialogues, and how you are able to strengthen the role of those who within a council have a smaller role because they are designed for people, for civil society to have smaller roles, at least in the Brazilian case. No? Okay, let's see.
Hi, Professor.
Okay.
My name is Mauricio, and I'm Brazilian. And as you said earlier, many NGOs are influenced, not to say controlled, by big companies who fund them. And I don't want to put you in a difficult spot, but could you comment a little bit more on this topic and tell us about the power those companies have in modeling the public opinion and the consequences of it?
Mm-hmm. Well, talking in general terms, what you see, for example, in the American case, looking in terms of the oil industry, the role that oil industry has in terms of influencing, fueling NGOs that have bring up a different approach on terms of the non-renewable energies. No, so this is very clear. There are some strong names, and everybody knows when you talk about it. Say the Koch brothers on the oil industry in the U.S., and you have an excellent book by Naomi Klein that brings the discussion capitalism versus climate change. It was published 4 or 5 years ago. And last week there was a good article on the New York Times Review that is now translated into Portuguese in Facebook, that you can read it, about the role of these companies. Now, it's important to stress, for example, I'm bringing up this issue. I can also talk a little bit about the Brazilian case, but as we are on a larger public, I prefer to bring up those issues that are stronger. But the way that companies can influence is very, there is a large range. But in many cases, NGOs that are financed by companies, they are basically focused on their agenda. And then they bias the agenda of an NGO, because these NGOs are created, are developed on a basis that is mainly a structure with organized by the participants of this NGO, but they are not supported, at least financially. They may be supported ideologically, but not supported financially, so they have to depend on companies and their agendas, say to deal with environmental education in many countries. So that's an example of it. So what it's basically, many NGOs can be even engaging in some kind of greenwashing by companies that need this agenda to show that they are politically correct in terms of environmental issues. I think that is very important in terms of the indication of the weakness of civil society in terms of mobilizing its constituency, say, we can call it that way, to promote a different agenda. In Brazil, for many years, during dictatorship, we have to remember that Brazil had a dictatorship military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. And many of our NGOs, and I was in one of them, were financed by international cooperation. They left a very open space for an agenda that was to struggle for democracy. But after democracy came, then these financing of international cooperation diminished very much, and many NGOs had to apply to this solution of depending of companies, no? Of large companies. And in some cases they are freer, in others less. But I think that the best example is really those companies that are clearly, in the case of climate change, clearly to defend the skeptics on climate. No? In other cases, the activities, they are so small, so reduced, so locally established that they don't have a larger impact. No? Say, Greenpeace is also involved in a very large campaign against the exploitation of the coral reefs in the north of Brazil. And it's struggling against two large companies, BP and Total. BP reduced its involvement, but Total doesn't because, well, we're still in the oil era, and these companies, they want to take out of oil, and every time we see there's more oil existing and found in oceanic areas. So that's also an issue that is very relevant for the discussion on oceans. I try to bring the information, but not giving too many names, obviously. Okay, no, she's looking at you. I cannot deal with it.
Excuse me?
Okay.
Yeah. Can you please share some experiences that are based on Brazil's that how the indigenous population and the traditional leadership are facing the issues of overfishing?
Sorry, can you repeat and slower?
Can you please share some experiences that are based on Brazil that how the indigenous populations, I mean the coastal populations, and the traditional leadership are facing the issues of overfishing?
Well, when we talk about indigenous, we talk of inner land population, no? And basically what we have, I'm not a specialist on this issue, so I'm going to be very generalistic, but what we have is an issue of the demarcation of territories. That's an important aspect. And the other mobilizations are exactly bringing up the contradictions between how their land is being invaded, no? by the how you call it, the wood, the companies of wood. Some of the large companies that are doing a lot of irregular wood cutting are from Malaysia, in Brazil, no? And also the big issue about that is sometimes how some leaders of communities can be also co-opted by companies, no? In terms of a good business, but definitely being in a contradiction in terms of what they really have as their definition of an activity. But in many cases, and in the World Water Forum in March, I went also to the Alternative Water Forum, and there we could really see the barbaric activities against indigenous community. And Brazil is such a large country, and so many situations and so many perverse situations that affect directly their way of living. No? So many communities have been displaced from their localities because of the construction of dams mainly during dictatorship, but still there are examples like Belo Monte, which is very known internationally, where people were displaced by a so-called democratic government, no? As they were their land was directly occupied by the construction of dams. Unfortunately, Brazil is in the list of one of the countries where there is an enormous action, or an enormous quantity of initiatives that affect directly the indigenous communities. And there are some NGOs that are really very, very committed and involved, like Instituto Socioambiental, which is probably the largest in terms of indigenous community. But there are so many other small NGOs that are really very, very involved with the possibility of giving support, technical and educational support to NGOs. But it's a very relevant issue to be considered, because there is a very small number of indigenous communities still resting in the country if considering the original population.
Hi, I'm Amavi from Sri Lanka. I'm just wondering about your opinion on the significance of scientific and political literacy of a nation in policy-making decisions.
Can you repeat?
Yeah. Well, just wondering about your opinion on the importance of scientific and political literacy of a nation in policy-making decisions.
Okay. Well, there's an enormous range of situations, obviously. But in the Brazilian case, we have some cases where the scientific community was absolutely organized systematically through the Society for Advancement of Science, through all kinds of scientific organizations to question a certain type of policy. And we were defeated because the decisions are taken by a Congress that is basically biased by vested interest, be it on the forestry industry, be it on the rural industry, be it on the... So sometimes the scientific community can be really very organized, but when it comes to decision making, when it's not centralized and it depends on a Congress, you have to be also very strong in terms of lobbying your representatives to change their mind on the issues dealing with something that is seen by the scientific community as negative to the interest, to the general interest, if we can call it that way. So definitely it's very important that the scientific community that is part of civil society. But also we have to remember that there are scientists that are also defending the interests of government too. No? But definitely I think that it's very relevant that the scientific societies have to be more and more organized to be prepared to do also lobbying. Because lobbying is not a bad word. Lobbying is something that is really part of a society that is democratically organized and where that there is transparency about ideas, and these ideas have to be discussed publicly.
Oh, well, I would like to add something for the same question. So you just said that the scientific community face problems in convincing governments in policy making decisions. So I'm just again curious, how far should the scientific community go in persuading or convincing the government to act otherwise?
It has to go until the end.
And how far is that?
That depends. If there is no political persecution, it can go so far it can. If there's political persecution, then you have to see in terms of the survival of people. But I would say that in a democratic society, what is important is the public dialogue, that the public dialogue presents the contradictions and the issues and why these aspects are present. Here we had a big debate on the legislation on forestry, a big debate. And we were very we were very convinced about how we should be confronting the proposal of the government. But it's David and Goliath sometimes, no? So that's the big issue that we have to consider. But definitely, what is important is to build good arguments. And when it comes to a democratic society where you have a Congress that decides when it comes to legislation, well, that's unfortunately how people voted in to their representatives, and they can be for the people or against the people, although voted by the people.
Just continuing this question, do you believe in the scientific party that they are creating in USP and in scientific community, a party of scientists?
It's not a party of scientists. It's a because the party, the proposal, doesn't have to do with most of you, but say, as she put the question, it's the scientists saying we are defending the interests of scientists within a political party. So I think that's an important agenda, that scientists show that they are part of a society and they are really defending an agenda to defend science because of the way that science has been cutting, the government has been cutting investments, etc., etc. No, so I don't think it is a party of scientists, but obviously we are very weak. No, but I think it's important that scientists show that they have a role in society and that we have a larger number of representatives of science in Congress, definitely, and I support it. Yes.
Hi, my name is Lorena. I'm from Brazil. And you already answered my question about the NGOs, but I have another one. You said something that we always listen all around about that we are living at a turning point. And I always keep thinking about it because if we don't make changes now, why bother in the future? We won't have any more time, right? But what can we do as developing countries when the developed countries who should set an example for us, they are living treaties and agreements? What should we do? We don't have the examples.
I don't have my bolinha de cristal here, but look, definitely we have here an important issue to consider, and this has also to do with how much science is able to dialogue with society. There are some indications in a publication, I don't remember who it was, in Nature by Johan Rockström of Stockholm Environment Resilience Center, published an article in the beginning of the 2000s, about the reaching points of where several variables were clearly reaching its threshold, its level, acidification of oceans, for example, loss of biodiversity, lack of water, and other issues that are more chemical, because these chemicals, I cannot explain them to you, but I definitely think it's important for me to at least understand how much they imply in changing the natural processes. And this is a big issue. So science has been working a lot on it, no? And IPCC has practically, is an example, and it's a very recent articulation promoted by United Nations. IPCC is the International Panel on Climate Change, International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And more than 95% of its scientists are really working in terms of the improvement of metrics and outcomes to show scenarios on climate change. You have the most, say, those who are not so showing outcomes that are not so pessimistic, going to 2 degrees. Others that are on 4, and they're very pessimistic on 6. Nobody knows who will be. We don't know if we will be. I am for sure will not be alive anymore. Say, this is something, an open issue that we always have to remember. Trump is not forever, even if he believes he's God. So someday he will be disappearing, at least 8 years, if the Americans are so dumb that they will re-vote on him, no? So definitely there is an issue that has to be approached. I don't know, sometimes we believe, I think that never humanity, human mankind, was, how you say the word, confronted with something that is almost out of the hands. Because we are dealing with, obviously, mitigation, but what we are seeing more is that initiatives of adaptation have been increasing. I am president of the board of ICLEI South America, and ICLEI is Local Governments for Sustainability. And the agenda is an agenda to promote capacity building for municipalities, now on an issue called solutions based on nature. This is a new agenda that is being promoted by United Nations, by several NGOs. And the big issue is how much municipalities believe in the importance of engagement in agendas that has to do with reducing risks. Because when I talk about governance, I should have talked from the beginning that we live in a society, in a risk society. And we live in a society that has been dealing more with ex post, with ex ante. Because in many cases, what we see is that people are more committed and organized and more generous after the disasters, but not before. No? Because preventing implies, obviously, not only in investments in technology and different process, but it implies also in social technology. And what we have to promote more and more in the capacity of new professionals, and when I talk about social learning and when I talk about the interdisciplinarity, is because there is a need of people to understand that technology doesn't solve everything. Technology in the technocratic sense, but social technology is fundamental because there is where you capture hearts and minds of people. The dialogue between those who make others understandable in processes that need to have support. Say, in in Brazil, the case of disaster prevention only began really seriously when a lot of people died in a very serious disaster that took place near Rio de Janeiro in 2011, I think it was, no? There they invested a lot in technology, in centers of monitoring, etc., etc. But obviously, there are some natural phenomena like earthquakes that can be less considered because you don't know the level that the earthquake will take place. Now it happened in Indonesia, no? Very recently. But there are societies that are used to have natural phenomena every year, typhoons and hurricanes. So these societies, be it in the Caribbean, be it in the Indic Ocean, in the Pacific Ocean, they are more prepared to it. No? So definitely we have to advance more and more. I personally have been publishing several books for schools and communities as outcomes of the research project that I have been involved. And I think that university has to do that much more, not only for the how you say, the evaluations of the quality of articles, no? But also thinking more and more of this, of another type of outcome that has to come from the university, because we are paid to teach and to research. And we have to share more, not only with the scientific community, but we have to share much more with the society as a whole and in education. And here are some people that collaborated in some of this publication. We produced recently one on solid waste, another on sanitation, another climate change, another on areas of environmental protection, and on water. So I believe very much in this kind of work that we are able to do to communicate with society in a larger scale. And basically making people to be partners and not just subordinate them to our knowledge. This is a big challenge.
Hi, I'm Priya from Fiji. You mentioned about small island countries leading the international meeting, and I'm glad that Fiji took the presidency of COP23 last year. It was a big step for us, and we got international attention. But we still need to improve on our governance approach in this international arena, and it's still a challenge for us. So how do you think we should proceed with our governance approach in such big international meetings?
Yeah, I think it's there is a film about Tuvalu, no? Several films, because that's even more reference as in danger. But definitely, I think that the international community has to look at it not from a paternalistic perspective in terms of protecting, trying to reduce the impact. We don't know how the ocean will. No, nobody can control it that way. Only some crazy scientists can believe that geoengineering can really advance to reduce the impacts of climate change. So there is no easy answer to it, but definitely I think that there is a way that the representative of Fiji, and I saw the representative of Fiji also in the World Water Forum in Brasilia in March, there has to be more conviction of mankind about the risks that are really existing, because the government can do whatever it is able to do, but with clear limits and boundaries. So definitely it is absolutely deceiving and frustrating to imagine that some societies may disappear, because at least from a point of view of international cooperation, other solutions could be done. But There is a, look, we have to look it from different perspectives. One thing is the mobilization, the agreements, but the other issue is to attack the effective processes that are being the producers of emissions. Say, on energy, United States is really backlagging, no? Basically because of its president. But local governments or states of the United States are not taking, are going against the current, no? Against the mainstream in terms of energy. This is an example. But definitely there are issues, and there is a very complex aspect to be considered, that is, how are the logics of production and consumption able to be changing when you see that markets are invaded by a lot of junk that people buy. But this junk that people buy are giving jobs to millions of people, and very unstable jobs, and very fragile jobs, and very indecent jobs. No? You see the whole aspects of textile in Bangladesh and the terrible working conditions, but not only in Bangladesh, in Brazil, in many other countries. No? So the size of the complexity indicates exactly how far we can go. There is a tendency to say, okay, let's now use electric cars. But electric cars still are using conventional energy because it's produced by energy. So the question is car necessary, or can we move more and more with public transportation? But definitely cars are linked to status, and cars, somebody who never had a car is willing to have a car, even if it gets congested. No? Now in New York, you have an example, they're stopping the licensing of cars for Uber because they have more than 100,000 Ubers driving in New York. So you see that this is not the solution. The solution is obviously much more into a more general interest type of policy. So the complexity is enormous, absolutely enormous. We are doing, say, part of it. There is trying to reduce the use of extraction through different approaches, like circular economy, for example, no? That is now being stressed. How much can we reduce the solid waste production? We can, if we have better selective collection, recycling, reuse, remanufacturing, all this kind of thing. How much are governments involved into it? How much do private companies of sanitation do not want to do that because they lose their agenda, they lose their revenues, and basically you continue having business as usual. So it's absolutely complex to dialogue on it, but it's necessary, and Fiji has to defend itself from something that it didn't invent for her. No? People live in islands because of the way that migrations took place since prehistorical eras. No? Good luck for Fiji. I'm for it.
Okay. My name is Dragana. I'm from Serbia. And you already started answering the question that I'm about to ask. So I want to know what you think on how you said that we have a task as a civil society to vote better so that the government will be more like in the same line as we are and having the same agenda as we do. So how can we do this if the candidates that are presented to us are all kind of our opponents? And how do we fight this? Because it seems like hopeless. And how do we mobilize the society if they think it's hopeless?
Well, I think that hopelessness is not eternal. So definitely there is a challenge. I think we have a world challenge today of leaders. Definitely there is this issue. It's also important to consider how people are uncomfortable with politics. They mistrust politics. But at the same time, people are sometimes very comfortable and don't mobilize sufficiently to promote new leaderships. I don't say that's an easy task, but each society has to look at that too. We have elections now 3 months from now. We don't know who we will vote or whatever. So I think we are in a transition moment of traditional politics to Facebook politics. I don't know, something like that. And that's very worrisome. That's definitely very worrisome. But look, if civil society believes in democracy, believes in reducing inequality, believes in reducing degradation of natural resources, it believes in the importance of education, and so there have to arise from civil society new parties, new organizations that will continue into the political arena, because we won't solve that with Facebook. We will solve it really having stronger understanding of what is at stake in each society. But unfortunately, we are dealing, say, in Europe with a very complex aspect, which is immigration. And we are dealing also in the United States with the fact that the immigrants will be, or the people that were not original from the United States, the black population and the Latin American countries' immigration will be a very important demographic role in the future. That will change completely. In Europe, it may change also very, very much. No? So I cannot talk in the short range. In the short range, what we are seeing is, unfortunately, governments more to the right, xenophobia, considering that many of the immigrants are leaving their countries because of absolute lack of hope or political persecution. So we are dealing with aspects that are basically, have to be basically seen as humanitarian. And what we have seen now, and very recently, the role of the Italian government, for example, is dramatic, because people are sometimes being in the sea and nobody wants them, or the way that the Trump government has presented the immigrants also in a very pejorative, in a very prejudiced approach. So short range, I think that there is a big dark or gray moment, no? A cloud that has to be overcome for future generations, I believe, no? Because definitely we cannot say politics is something bad, because we are part of a system where there is, if democracy and not ruled by military, if it's democracy, we have to deal with the contradictions and the enormous range of political approaches and absurdities also, no? But it depends on society. So my answer is very, I don't say subjective, but very based on my personal experience and what I see, how things are being dealt. I think that definitely a situation where one of the large world players, that is the US, is playing such a negative role, but you also have to see how China decided to have a eternal government, no? Decided to have. So this implies also that the logics of democracy is losing ground also worldwide, no? That's very worrisome. Where else? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Staying on logical democracy. My name is Shola. I'm from Nigeria. I want to know what is going to be the role, or what should be the role of Brazil in exporting, and if it is possible, good. If it is possible, good and environmental governance. I put it this way. In the 90s, America was exporting democracy. After Bill Gates, Clinton, then you have a new government in America. There was a reduction in investment in Africa. And due to this, China stepped in. But we know China has not helped Africa. So where are we? What should we do? What should we believe in this kind of context when global governance is Eurocentric? And how do we decolonize this kind of discussion? How do we deconstruct the kind of discussions that, is Eurocentric and it has to be the way they say? And whereas you have a country like Brazil in BRICS that seems to, have a way of doing things. For example, you cited River Basin Committee. OECD believes is very good. Is it possible for Brazil to take a leadership role in this contest and export it? What could be the global benefit for Brazil? And can this rescue us from the hand of China?
Look, water basin committees, for example, or they were not invented in Brazil. No, there is a long story of how, basically, in modern societies, there has been, say, democratic organization through councils, and this has a lot to do with a history linked, for example, to the Italian Communist Party post-war, no? Talking about councils and boards, etc. Gramsci talks about that. So I think that it's not a role that it has Brazil to play. What it has to be obviously brought up is how the legislation on environment includes as a moment of decision a role of a water basin committee. Say, we had in Brazil, and depending on the municipalities, a much more democratic process of decision. But the contradictory of this is the administrative discontinuity, because it depends on the agenda of the political party to implement or to deconstruct this. But it depends also on society to question when there is a discontinuity. And in many cases, society keeps silence and doesn't really defend some type of victories that it had with a more democratic process of engagement. Definitely. And I think that that is something we have to look at. Holland has water boards, France has other models. The Brazilian model of water legislation is very influenced by the French legislation. And the Peruvian legislation has elements of the Brazilian. But this has to do also with the way how government is organized, and also has to do with the different political moments of a society. Nigeria is a country that is seen as a country that may have the largest demographic growth in Africa. And considering its present situation, and how it was important, the oil extraction, and now the decrease of the price of oil, it brings a very worrisome aspect in terms of the growth. Lagos will be one of the largest cities in the world. Is Lagos prepared to do that? So that is also something that has to do with the demographics of our society. Africa is seen, say, if the population is estimated to grow to 10 billion and then stabilized, European countries stabilize completely. Brazil has practically a European growth, 1.2%, but it grew more than 2% per year. São Paulo in the 70s and until the 80s grew around 6% per year. Now it grows less than 1%. It has to do also with urbanization. It has to do with the logics of modernization, if we can call it. So I think that in Nigeria there have to arise leaderships that are able to show the importance of democratic arenas to discuss policy. Brazil, for example, had a very strong visibility with so-called participatory budget, and it decreased enormously, unfortunately, and it shouldn't, because I think it's an important role that people have more and more understanding and transparency of how their taxes are being used in terms of the benefit that they obtain. Lack of transparency is something that obviously reduces democracy. There is an important need of accountability to show how resources are being spent. And obviously, if resources are being badly spent, society has to say we have to change leaderships. No? So I don't have a recipe, and I think that Brazil doesn't have to export. It shouldn't be also depending only on the export of natural resources. It should be also, because that's 19th century's logic, no? And unfortunately, many of our countries depend still on a logic where we are the exporters or the exporters of natural resources or mining that are based on very perversive practices of mining with people working in very bad conditions all worldwide, no? Okay.
Hi, I'm Marcelina Felix Moshe from Tanzania. Maybe I should convince all of us about the combination of scientific community and the local community together with the political leaders, acting or thinking of the same goal and how to attain the goal. The only way that I can convince you to achieve this is now to start thinking of how to deal with the community, because the political leaders who are making up the government to work on anything that you are thinking you want to attain, they are normally actively listening to the community what they want. So maybe we should now start thinking how we should let the community act towards, or maybe if we need like managing or conserving the natural resources. Now we should, because we have so many papers concerning the management or conserving the natural resources. And these papers are derived from the local communities. And the communities, if I ask any of us in this room, if you conducted your research, especially the social science researches, which are actively involving the local communities, most of these communities always need us back, like giving out the feedback and working with them on what you went there for. So going back and working with these communities gives the positive impact to the government, because whatever or whenever we approach the government to act upon the scientific output that we give, they normally think like we need fund from them. That's it. So they will always act negative towards it. So dealing with the community, like we need to do the management of, I'm interested in mangroves. Maybe we need to do the management and conservation of mangroves. And I did maybe a research, social research to mangroves. And I decided to go to that community because they need me and tell them, okay, maybe you should start do this and this and this and this. When the government sees positive impact towards what I did, they'll start acting upon, because they need the votes from the people. So they are going to start to act towards the people, like supporting them and what, so that they can get the votes. That's how we can get, or we can really grab these political leaders towards our side. And the second thing, I think I'm going to take you to a different room. We have been discussing about the political governance, and I would like to hear anything about the traditional governance, because it plays a very big role in conservation and management of natural resources. And also, I would like to know, because we heard from the beginning, the governance is the dialogue between the top and the bottom. And if I speak about the traditional governance, especially in my beautiful country in Tanzania, there is a very huge gap between the bottom leadership and the top leadership, which if I speak about the top, I'm speaking about the political top leaders, and if I speak about the bottom, referring to the traditional governance, I'm speaking about the clan leaders and so forth, because play very big role in management and conservation of natural resources, but still we have a gap, and that gap is explained by the unrecognition, or the government not appreciating their presence as they play a very great role in management of natural resource. So what do you think we can have to bridge the gap between the top and the bottom leadership, especially in the context of managing or conserving the natural resources?
Well, thank you for your narrative. I think it's always very relevant to be sharing the narratives, because we have to understand the differences. Africa has been ruled on a colonialist I don't know if the word is perspective, governments, no? So, and African countries have been having their independence much more recently. And in many countries, there is a big issue about how to emphasize the role of traditional knowledge. But at the same time, there are sometimes misunderstandings about how these cultural aspects work. Now, I think that that's what you brought about. I cannot talk about traditional African culture, obviously, and sometimes it brings up also a biased understanding also about how traditional logic works. The issue to consider is how much the traditional logic can be really put more into place into how democracies work. And I think that's something that each society has to deal with it, because I would be saying things without any clear understanding about it. But definitely Africa is undergoing very complex processes. Say the issue of land grabbing, for example, in Africa is dramatic because Chinese are buying land to produce their basic inputs for 1.3 billion people. No? Imagine if India begins to do that also. No? Definitely the issue of dialogues between top and bottom has to do with how the top is democratic or not democratic, how people are able to understand it understand not the, because you mentioned how much the traditional logic is geared towards conservation, toward the protection of natural resources. But unfortunately, what we see is that in many cases, the governments overcome this need to protect natural resources and affect directly the traditional communities. No? So I don't have an answer for it, definitely, but I would share the same idea that are the leaderships of traditional communities democratic in terms of the way that they are ruling with the constituency, for example? I think that's an important aspect. Are they sharing these ideas, these visions of how to bring up better living conditions, development in a democratic way? Are they being seduced by ideas of development that be absolutely contradictory to what is needed in the logic of the traditional community? So it's very open, but definitely I think that this sharing of your narrative and other narratives can be very useful in such a larger public like this experience that we are having here. No, I think that's one of the most important moments to have, is this sharing, because sharing also makes that we have less vicious prejudices, that we have an open understanding of how things work completely differently in each in the different societies too. And I think that this colonialists didn't understand. And if we try to think about decolonization, we really have to be much more open-minded and see how this has a different, has to be seen in a different logic. Unfortunately, still, we have much more, even in science, much more presence of the Anglo-Saxon ways of dealing with things than of our autochthonous approaches. And we need to produce more and more science that is much more nationally based, regionally based, and this is a big challenge today. And also for the international community, people have to publish in articles that follow the logic of an Anglo-Saxon way of producing knowledge. Is that the best way? Well, I'm an editor of a journal for already 1997 I began. It's called Environment Society. And it's a journal that we publish today. All articles originally were published only in Portuguese and Spanish, but now all articles that are published have to be published also in English, because unfortunately English is a language that unifies, no? And it's on a digital basis, so everybody can share. There are a lot of, we will be organizing a special, not a volume, because now the journal is annual, no? Yearly. So next year we will have a lot of articles on oceans, and they all will be published in English to share the knowledge. But definitely we have to be more reactive to some types of logics that have been created, where very small number of editing houses controls the whole editing system of knowledge and science in the world. And that is also very worrisome, because it creates a dependency on publishing on these houses, editing houses, and universities are evaluated, or programs are evaluated by the qualification that these journals have in the different countries. So this is also important in terms of the production of science. And definitely we have to create more and more journals, not the predatory journals that have been multiplying, but really create more and more journals that are more democratic in terms of the way that the content is being produced. And this has to do a lot with you, because you are beginning your careers and beginning to produce science with your advisors or on your own. No, I think. So all these narratives are very, very relevant. We have still half an hour if you're okay. I'm okay, even standing.
Okay. Right. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay. Where are you?
I'm here, right here.
Okay.
My name is Tanya Moigwa from South Africa. So I think in the previous session you gave you made a very nice point about the importance of interdisciplinary research in informing governance. And I think when you talk about interdisciplinary research, you are addressing, co-production of knowledge across all disciplines, science, economy, political, and all of that. And this includes the local knowledge of, indigenous communities as well. So the issue here is that in the table of the decision makers, like the governance and the policy makers, there seems to be a need for evidence-based kind of information, where there's trends of how temperature might have changed or how the rand is doing against dollar, all that kind of knowledge. And so that's what seems to be needed in the table of policymakers. But now, if we think about local knowledge and indigenous communities, resource users, who accumulate knowledge over a long time from one generation to another, and this kind of knowledge is not documented per se. It's all about perceptions and experiences. But that knowledge is fine, rich, detailed knowledge, at a community level, which could be very important to inform policymakers and help to adapt to things like climate change and what's or not. So now my question is, for this kind of knowledge that is traditional, that does not have trends, that does not have, that does not seem to provide evidence, what are the chances of this kind of knowledge to land in the table of the decision makers, and to what extent can this kind of knowledge inform the policies?
Excellent question. I think that I believe that the idea of narratives is getting more ground. I have been realizing that if you look at the New York Times, for example, it uses a lot the narratives. I mean the New York Times because it's an international publication. It considers, it gives very much importance to the narratives. So, again, we come to the aspects. Are the local governments enough democratically as to take into account narratives? That's the big issue. Because as you mentioned, there may be no trends to the future, but there's a lot of history before. And that brings up exactly the need to understand this dialogue. Even if it's full, even if there are biases, even if there are different understandings, I think traditional knowledge is relevant, but I don't think that we have to put it as the main explanation. We have to work on the hybridization of these knowledges. And the idea that you brought about co-production is essential. We have to, and when we talk about interdisciplinary, we are talking about co-production. I'm a social scientist. I'm not a biologist, I am not an oceanographer, but I'm open to the dialogue with them when I do a project. I'm open to it. Otherwise, I wouldn't do the project with them. I would just work with sociologists. Actually, what I less do is working with sociologists. So definitely, this is the big challenge of, say, knowledge. What does knowledge imply today? Are we just producing knowledge to publish, or are we producing knowledge to share it in a perspective of establishing a dialogue with those who don't have the knowledge but should have it, say. So the narratives are essential. Sometimes it's not easy to do it because sometimes the narratives are, people only believe in their narratives and they don't take into account other approaches also. So there is a big challenge. In many countries, this is not relevant anymore because they are so homogeneous in terms of the knowledge that it doesn't make sense. But in many Latin American countries, in many African countries, Southeast Asian countries, definitely this is an aspect that has to be more and more considered, and bringing up the capacity to make the narrative part of the understanding of a process that has to be understood for its past, but it also has to be looked for its future. And definitely narrative breaks up with the idea of purely metrics. No? Metrics, I mean. We live in a world that is governed by metrics. You open the newspaper, every news is based on numbers. And people just give the numbers if they were a given, if they were the absolute truth. No? Even elections. No? So there is a big challenge of how to deal with the metrics and simultaneously with the narratives and the understanding. This is something we have to work more and more. And when it comes to issues linked, say, to climate change, that is a big challenge, to decodify, to recognize the importance of narratives, and at the same time to approach science from approach science to society and to policymakers and decision makers. Because we always have to remember that decision makers have a term of permanence. So you have, what I mentioned before, a lot of discontinuity, mainly, say, in our so-called developing countries, it's even much stronger because their constituency is less organized. No? So this is worrisome because obviously you have to have stronger officials in government, stronger I mean in terms of knowledge, that are able to really maintain initiatives that are doing well. And basically in terms of public policies, how to deal with it. Because nobody has the answer which is the best public policy. But definitely, always public policies are some kind of experimentation, no? Even if they're doing well. But when they're doing well, they should be really guaranteed their continuity if they're really reaching their goals. And their goals are, when you talk about public policy, you have to look in terms of efficiency, effectiveness, and equity. So you have to look at that. It's not only that they're efficient, because they can be efficient in using the resources, but not efficient in reaching the goals or reaching the population in terms of equity or in terms of reducing poverty. No? So you have to look at all these aspects in terms of a public policy, no? And also being able to discuss an agenda of public policy when you come to national debates before elections, for example.
Okay.
Are we done? No?
No,
Who
no,
is?
as you have a question.
Sorry.
Okay,
I'm going to sit now
thank
because
you
I
very
got
much.
tired.
Thank you very much, Professor Pablo. I think you've answered all my questions, but I just want to express a point of curiosity. And that will be closely related to the question of my cousin Shola from Nigeria. I want to ask, because you were clear that there's a difference between governance and good governance. Of course, the latter including aspect of participation, transparency. So I want to ask, from your experience and opinion, do you think, regardless to the current or previous government structure in Brazil. Do you think there's good governance, ocean governance in Brazil?
In Brazil?
Yeah, in Brazil. Do you think there's good ocean governance in Brazil?
Look, well, we have an illegitimate government at this moment. No, the impeachment was invented by a political process. So, I'm not a candidate. Definitely, at this moment, we just want the government to leave as quick as possible, but we don't know what will be coming after. It can even get worse. So, the issue of good government, I don't believe in that word. So I presented it to you, but I don't believe in the idea of good governance. I believe in the idea of democratic governance. I believe in the idea of countries that have enormous bias and inequalities that it has to reduce. And Brazil has enormous bias in education, in health, and now we are also in a very dramatic situation in terms of security, violence, the role of organized gangs like Mexico. No? Mexico said no to the traditional governments. I don't know what will happen, no? Because unfortunately the vested interests are very strong and they can overcome even those governments that make promises of change, no? And that's very complicated. The role today of these gangs, of organizations, criminal organizations, is becoming stronger and stronger and very worrisome because they're also having their representatives in Congress. So this is also very, very worrisome. But effective, the countries like Brazil, what they need is to reduce inequalities, to guarantee health for the larger part of the population that has very low incomes and cannot pay for the private system. It has to improve education, definitely. What does this imply? Basically that we have almost 35% of population with what we called functional illiteracy. That implies of people that go to school but get out of school without having an understanding of the basics to be a citizen. And we talk citizenship when you deal with your rights and with your your tasks. I don't know the word now, sorry. That's citizenship, because you have also to consider that you have also to obey rules, norms, no? And unfortunately, illiterate or functionally illiterate citizens are in many cases easier to manipulate in one side, but also they may become very indignated and revolting, and also provoke situations of social turmoil that are not good for democracy also. So we have both sides to look at. Democratic society has to deal with an understanding of the public interest and not only of the specific interest. And unfortunately, many countries have been ruled much more into a logic of reduced interests, not of the interest rates of the banks. I'm talking reduced interests in the sense of the collective, the public interest. And obviously dealing with the main decisions that have to be taken. Say, today we have to look at how we protect the environment. What does that imply? It's not necessarily only on a conservationist perspective, because that may reduce enormously the possibility of dealing with sustainable practices. how much in, say, African countries it's needed to have more and more an understanding of policies that aggregate people's survival with sustainability. For example, where you have larger areas of environmental protection. This is a big challenge, an enormous challenge. I believe more and more that in these countries we have to bring up policies that guarantee a development that is, the word you use it as an adjective, sustainable. No? And that always implies in changing in many ways the logics of the public policies. No? The Amazon is always under the risk, not of disappearing, but being more and more affected. And we have to remember that the Amazon is a lung for the world, one of the lungs of the world for the quality, no, of different aspects of the biodiversity and climate even, no? Say, scientists argue here that we have the droughts in the south of Brazil, central south of Brazil, because of the changes in terms of the degradation of the Amazon. We call it flying rivers, for example. There is all an approach on that. It's not necessarily the only approach to it. But what we see today is that more and more countries are being affected by water scarcity. Some are solving it by using the ocean water, no? But it has an important cost, no? For example, Barcelona has been using it, several parts of Egypt have been using it also. But definitely what we have to look is that and many countries are also already somehow adapted by their original condition, but it's getting worse. So the need to have policies that make people more rational in terms of the use of water is fundamental, for example. And this implies in something that we have to aggregate always when we talk about public policies on environment, at least, that is how to bring people to become more co-responsive, but co-responsive without being the villains when the process is not doing well. The co-responsibility has to do with public policies that engages the population in something where they feel that they are part, not when they are called when already you are almost drowning or almost having water on your knees. No? So this is one of the big issues also on governance, how to promote co-responsibility where really the process is that you are part of a system that can be undergoing under very serious degradation, or a system that can be really in very good good sustainable situation. So we have to consider also these aspects. And in general, governments do not want to divide very much, to share very much the responsibility with citizens, because citizens, when they are really organized and qualified, they are capable of bringing up demands, questionings, and a different approach to how things are being ruled or taking place. No? I don't have a recipe, and I don't think that Brazil has to export anything, except its natural resources to survive, at least, at this moment. Yes.
Hi, I'm Victor from Brazil. And when you were talking about the democratic governance, the idea seems very nice and beautiful in theory. But in my opinion and from my personal experience, I think that decision-making processes can be democratic until it reaches a point that start some conflict with major economic interests. So you said some things about the water crisis in São Paulo, and I remember that people had to adapt to stay 2 days without any water, while industries didn't have any cut in their supply. So what I wanted to ask you is if you agree with my statement that governance can be democratic and participatory, but until it reaches some point that affects economic interests, and how do you think we can tackle this?
Well, one thing is, as you mentioned, what we would like to be. That is, theory brings up a discussion on models or realities. No? In the water crisis, definitely, and I wrote a lot on it, and even in English, the irresponsibility of the government, the lack of transparency, increased the situation because it put all the guilt on St. Peter, no? The climate, the rain. No? So definitely the issue is the way of governance, the lack of transparency, the vested interests, because these, what you mentioned, the contracts with the companies. But citizens have also a role because they are re-voting on this government for 24 years. No? So, and the companies, well, there we have a big discussion, and I think that's also very interesting. It gets more special, more specialized, I say, that maybe the interest of the group, but there has been a movement towards the remunicipalization of the water system in several countries. There is an NGO called Transnational Institute that gives public access to a lot of publications on the experience. I don't know how many remunicipalizations have taken place. I talked with a coordinator of the project during the World Water Forum, but I really don't want to say the number because I think it's more than 300 remunicipalization. But this has to do a lot of remunicipalization on an effective basis that the population is part of it, or remunicipalization because you give it to public companies. And there comes another important aspect to discuss besides co-responsibility, that it is social control. And when we talk about public services, we have to really consider the importance of social control. It's not the case of the public company of water and sanitation in São Paulo. So definitely the lack of transparency, and I participated in this articulation of NGO called Alianza pela Agua, and unfortunately, again, it's David versus Goliath. No, the press is also more on the side of the state company, and unfortunately, our role, although very efficient in terms of our capacity, absolutely insufficient to be within the media and express our opinion. The media practically didn't give us any space because, you know, things, even if you are in the digital media, but when you are in the digital media, you are within a bubble, no? And you are not necessarily on a larger public. So the water crisis, the need to avoid water crisis is exactly to consider the existence of water scarcity as part of the reality. We cannot hide it. We cannot become ostriches. It's real. We cannot put our heads under the earth. The problem of water scarcity is becoming worse and worse worldwide, and it's very easy a water crisis to have an outcome of a social turmoil. Definitely it is something that we have to avoid because there will be victims that are absolutely innocent, and situations where there has been, when the Bolivian case took place, they talked the future are world wars and not petroleum wars. Well, I hope not. No? But definitely the issue of scarcity has to do with governance, with transparency, with accountability, with co-responsibility, and with social control. So you have a good agenda of wordings that are part of to understand governance. And I think that has to do exactly with the fact that we are dealing with words that are not simply slogans, but there are words that have a meaning in terms of a more democratic way of dealing with the scarcity of national resources, that's what we're talking, or with the degradation of natural resources, as we're here involved with the Ocean Week.
Luis, I have one question. Some years ago, I was in a meeting with some traditional population leaders from remote areas, and was a farmer there trying to sell the idea that grass is better than rainforests and mangroves, because rainforests and mangroves are huge trees and use more water than grass. And with the grass, you can put cow. So you protect your water and you make money and food. And most of them was believing it. So how can we fight this kind of fake news? Then
we come back to the issue of non-governmental associations, non-governmental organizations bringing up an understanding of the role of mangroves, of the role of wetlands. No? I'm now involved collaborating with an NGO called Wetlands that is working in Mato Grosso to begin to deal with the issue of protecting mangroves and wetlands. So the answer is the capacity of people not to being manipulated, but definitely there is a big issue when there is such an inequality in terms of revenue, of inequality, social inequality, and if people do not have an understanding of the real trends that are part of a process of substituting biomas practically, no, or ecosystems, that's a problem. And then the answer is really bringing up an understanding, and at the same time, the issue of how to articulate the possibility of development with the nature being protected, no? But in some cases it may, I don't know, I'm not a specialist in this, some cases it may not be possible, I don't know. There I don't have the answer, but definitely knowledge and informed knowledge is essential, because people may be manipulated by an understanding they will get more earnings with a situation like that when they are in a very fragile condition. No?
Hi Pedro, my name is Bruno from Brazil. Considering ocean governance, I have the feeling that the institutional diversity regarding laws and behaviors about the ocean governance is increasing in the last 20 or 30 years, and most of it regarding climate change. And on the other hand, we have the increasing arena talking about that, and we have some delays in considering the practical results we need from them. Like you said about the work from Rockstrom, and we have these scenarios from climate change for IPCC, and when we look to the future, we think like the time is going up, you know, we need to hurry and take decisions and implement decisions and see results, exactly considering that part of them are not exactly what we want, so we can make mistakes along the way. So this kind of stalemate between democratic participation and the need of taking action, I would like to hear from you on that, and especially if you see drivers moving out from this situation, and if they are present, where are they taking us? Thank you.
the drivers, I think it's essential to discuss, and you are involved with ecosystemic services, so I think that there are some drivers that have to be more and more disseminated and implemented. Ecosystemic payments, services and payments are essential. And that brings us to the discussions of solution based on nature. No? How much these are to be the real mainstream for the future. Are we able to do that? Are we? How long that will be? We have to see that happen. Look, we are in a moment where obviously essential decisions should be taken, but are not taken. What we are seeing is a multiplication of initiatives where we are not saying we are not against the capitalist logic, because that's what is taking place, but of initiatives that are indicating a certain hybridization. There is a new book by Ulrich Beck that he didn't write because he was already dead, but his widow and some colleagues helped to produce with his idea. And the book is called The Metamorphosis of the World. It's published in Brazil. I don't know, it probably published always in English. It's very recent, 2 months now. And I think that the big discussion today is about the metamorphosis, how we're dealing with the mainstream or logics of business as usual and confronting it. And when I mentioned aspects like circular economy or different ways of governing enterprises or other types of initiative, obviously very much linked to the idea of ecosystems services. This is new. All this is new. And there will be more acceptance as more we are able to produce knowledge that indicates the importance of these ideas. No? Because still, even when we look at ecological economics, it's still not mainstream. It should be in the 21st century, but we're still talking about supply and demand. When we're talking about produce the agenda for water, we're still looking at producing investing in large infrastructure, and we are not looking in other ways of producing infrastructure, like, for example, called soft path, which is basically logic on more local initiatives and practice. It's not that this is new, because UN talks about all these kinds of alternative ways, community-based organizations to deal with basic sanitation and others for many, many years. But it seemed that all this was almost covered by the large technocratic initiative, and also not forgetting the role of the vested interest in construction industries in all countries, the national, international vested interests that were always saying that the best solutions are these infrastructures. And we're now beginning to see that this can be different. No? So I cannot give you the complete answer, but I really consider that if we are very pessimistic, we say that nothing will really be able to make things change. But I don't know, it seems that governments or the international community is waiting for the worst disasters to take the most radical initiative. I don't know what that means, no, because we're talking about something that is already beginning to take place. What will be when we think about what will be the main product of the capitalist system in the next century? I don't know, but probably won't be cars anymore, no? still, say, in Brazil, if you have a reduction in the production of cars, the whole economy falls down. No? It's absurd, but that's the reality. And still, the countries are struggling in terms and competing in terms of this already very obsolete object from the end of the 19th century, which works still with the same logic. No? So, and we also have to be very worried about how the digital divide and the educational divide can bring more inequality to our society. So we have to be able to create more and more jobs that are not necessarily linked to government or to companies. And then when we look at that, we have to see that the autonomous creation of activities, of revenue of people may be of very different ways of organizing economic life in the future. No? I don't know if you read this book. I mean, everybody. There's a Israeli historian who teaches in Oxford, and he wrote 2 books. Now there's a third one called Sapiens and Homo Deus. I recommend very much this reading because it brings up, Sapiens is more a reading about the history of mankind, but looking to the present. And Homo Deus is looking from the present to the future. And we have to deal with all these issues because you're part of the future. No? And definitely there are aspects that we are absolutely unable yet to predict, but there's clearly one idea that we cannot disconsider. Less jobs will exist because more and more automatization and more presence of the digital will reduce jobs. We already saw this in the banking industry very clearly. We will see it more and more. No? And all this implies that considering the growth of population, at least in some parts of the world, it's very worrisome because people are also migrating from the rural areas to the city because all this modernization also in the rural area is expelling people too. No? So there are so many issues into agenda, and that brings up exactly the whole discussion. Reducing the presence of small rural owners in areas in many countries implies in the expansion of larger landowners, investors, and obviously in another way of use of land. And this is something absolutely very worrisome also.
Pedro Dias from Brazil, and my question is, what is your opinion about the governance and the RESEX councils?
RESEX? RESEX are the reserve of natural exploitation. And what we see, again, is that a lot of questions, and I'm not a specialist, no, but I advise a thesis on that so I can talk a little bit, otherwise I wouldn't talk. But basically is that the payment for the services are very low, and that doesn't motivate the small producers to be involved, like in the same case of payment of services in terms of the protection of watersheds. The logic is so implies in such a small benefit that it doesn't attract in the same way. And unfortunately, no, because it has also to do with the failure of the Kyoto Protocol, no, and how much this has to be rewritten and thought in a different way. But it always has to do with that, because when you come to the payment of ecosystemic services, this has to be something that people really feel that they are having a benefit. Otherwise, it's more theory than practice. And what we see, unfortunately, in the case of the payment of ecosystemic services, I'm only talking Brazil because it's not my field, but the payment is so small that it doesn't really motivate very much. But there are other variables also to take into account, cultural variables that are also essential when we come to discuss these aspects of the so-called benefit of doing something right, but paying wrongly. Are we all hungry?
Yes. We would like to thank Pedro and you all for this participation.
Thank you very much for your excellent question. It was great, and also a great opportunity to be talking with people of so many different places with so many different ideas, and look forward to work more and more with narratives. That's very useful to really understand better the differences. Thank you very, very much.
Pedro will be with us on the 17th and 18th, so you have the time to talk to him again.